USA. For those of you who are less familiar with us, we are a public charity headquartered in New York, and we provide US donors, whether individuals, families, corporations, foundations, or advisors to donors, with a suite of services to support their international giving to anywhere in the world. And we also partner with foreign nonprofits and offer them a solution to receive tax-deductible gifts from their donors in the United States. And we do this through our American Friends Fund service. Just to give a quick snapshot of our reach, in 2024, we facilitated 169 million in grants across 89 countries to over 700 nonprofits. And you can check out our 2024 annual snapshot. We just posted it online to learn more about our impact. And now, with no further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. We have with us Caroline Kronley, who's president of the Tinker Foundation and a board member at Myriad USA. Welcome, Caroline.
Thank you.
And we have Monica Carrillo Zegarra, who is our director for Latin America and the Caribbean here at Myriad USA. And thank you both for your time, Monica and Caroline, for joining us today and sharing your insights. I know both of you have a ton of experience in this space to speak from, so I'm going to squeeze every minute that we have out of this hour to pick your brains on what's going on in the region. Just to start us off, Caroline, why are we talking about this today? Why is Latin America such an important region for donors to learn about, to fund? What's unique? Why should we be paying attention? Give us your thoughts.
Yeah, I think it is an incredibly important region, but you wouldn't necessarily know it from the data, Sheena. So if you look at international grant making from the US, we see that only about 6% of international grant funding is going to Latin America. That includes Mexico, but it does not include the Caribbean, which is only at 1%. So that's another challenge we can talk about today. But so why do I think that's a missed opportunity? In fact, I think the percentage going to Latin America should be disproportionately higher for a couple of reasons. One has to do with kind of solving global problems, and one has to do with finding solutions. And I think both are of concern for donors. So in terms of some of the big problems facing the world, many of those do run through Latin America. So if we think about key places where action on climate change will be incredibly important. Of course, the Amazon and other tropical rainforests in Latin America come immediately to mind for all of us. If you're a donor who cares about migration, some of the largest populations of displaced people are in Latin America, not just coming to the US, but really within Latin America itself. And then on the solution side, and I think this is something that isn't necessarily, broadly recognized outside of the region, Latin America is a diverse region, but one thing that it has in common is an incredibly vibrant civil society, from the kind of smallest grassroots organizations working on local issues all the way up to very sophisticated regional NGOs that are driving big policy changes. And so I really think of the region as a place where solutions are being developed that are relevant not just for countries in the region, but really the entire world, and happy to give more examples of that going forward. And then the last thing I'll say that's more about sort of the personal interests of donors, a lot of people in the US have a connection to Latin America of one kind or another. That might be a heritage connection. They might have spent some time in the region over the course of their lives. They might simply recognize the kind of geographic proximity, right, between the United States and the region. And so I think all of those are reasons that donors might be curious to learn more about what they can do.
Yeah, thank you. And you sort of touched on the diversity in terms of also the types of organizations, the sizes of organizations that we see across the region. Monica, can you dig a little bit deeper into that, just again, in terms of why this is such an important region for donors to learn about and fund? Talk a bit about the diversity, the complexity of the region. Why is it so important to highlight that as a key part of the nature of this region?
Yes, sure. Latin America has 33 countries, and it's very important to remember that in addition to the Spanish and the Portuguese, we have a lot of indigenous language. We have the Creole that is spoken in many Caribbean islands, but we have 560 indigenous languages. And because of that, our region, even if we are not too big in terms of number of countries, is very rich in terms of diversity. And as Carolina say, we are in the Americas, so many donors or just regular people, they visited the region to study, to do exchange when they were students, for vacation. And there is a very important connection and a lot of interest of people. Okay, how I can now support Cusco. I have an amazing time in the Amazon, how I can be connected with this community. And I think that is something that we value a lot because we belong to the same region, even if we speak a different language. And I think the language barrier is also very important to highlight because sometimes there is a lot of limitations for exchange of information or building long-term relationship between people in the US and Latin America. But I think, especially now, with a lot of the use of social media and a lot of more opportunities for traveling, there are more conditions, no, to increase this kind of interaction between the US and Latin America and the Caribbean. And I would like to highlight that we have some of the most important biomes, no, like Carolyn say, the Amazon. The Amazon really holds more than 100% of Earth's terrestrial biodiversity. But we also have other biomes like the Andes, the mountains. The water of the Amazon River is coming from the Andes. So the Andes are also a very important destiny for many people in Latin America, but it is like an epicenter of one of the most important produce and crops that we already have, like the potato. No, just in Peru, we have 4,000 kind of potatoes, and Mexico was the place where indigenous people domesticate the corn. So just sharing that two elements, no, corn and potato, and Latin America, I think that will be a very interesting tool to connect and to develop this emotional connection to our region.
Yeah, and maybe to follow up on that, what are you seeing as interests that donors have giving to the region right now? There's all this opportunity. We've talked about the diversity, both in what kinds of climate diversity there is. There's organizations that are doing all kinds of work. What are you seeing as a trend in terms of where donors are interested in investing? And do you think that that's well aligned with where there's need and opportunity right now?
I can continue. Yeah,
Yeah.
yes, I think that now, for many years, there was a lot of interest to support environmental programs, but more connected to the conservationist perspective, no, to protect natural parks, for example. But now I feel there are a little bit more of interest to support indigenous and Afro-descendant self-governance. So there are a lot of opportunities, for example, to create co-ops or startups of farmers that they are really now learning a lot of agroecological tools. And now many donors before, they just were saying, okay, we need to protect the Amazon or in general the environment, but they didn't know or they didn't really have a lot of information to understand how the communities for many generations, they have been able to protect and live in harmony with the space. But now I think there are more interest, and I think this is part of the advocacy that many philanthropic organizations have been doing for the last 20 years. And I think that there is a lot of support for this, or at least more interest. And this is why we want to create more spaces where donors can learn more about that indigenous and Afro-descendant self-governance, for example.
Thank you. Yeah, and Caroline, similar, what are you seeing in terms of what donors are interested in giving to? And I know that also at Tinker, you sort of have a process that assesses this and sort of does good matchmaking. So maybe you could give us a sense, both kind of broadly where you're seeing some of those trends and matching the region and maybe ways you're recognizing that.
Sure, absolutely. So a couple of big areas that I think are both of interest to donors and crucial in terms of philanthropic support. So one is education. And that is something that Tinker works on quite a bit. Latin America as a region has actually made really huge strides, especially in terms of access to basic education. Most children in the region at this point do have the ability to go to at least primary school. However, the kind of access to quality is much more variable, and there are a lot of persistent socioeconomic inequalities. And I will say that the region had some of the longest school closures due to the pandemic of anywhere in the world. So we really see a generation of kids whose learning is at risk. And that is something that I think both US foundations and donors and Latin American philanthropists are kind of coming together to work on as an area of shared concern. On the other hand, I'd highlight that, frankly, there's some places where US philanthropy is uniquely important because perhaps Latin American philanthropic actors are less active. So I just saw last week an analysis that indicates that 75% of funding for human rights in Latin America is coming from the United States philanthropic community. So that is a critically important role that donors of all sizes play in supporting a vibrant, equitable civil society and access to rights for people across the region. So that comes to mind as well. In terms of Tinker's own process, we have some kind of big areas of priority: governance and justice, education, as I mentioned, the environment, very much aligned actually with what Monica describes in terms of not just thinking about conservation or preservation of plants and animals, but also how you approach conservation in a way that recognizes the needs and rights of the communities that live within and depend on those resources. So a lot of work around, for example, fisheries, water management, trying to support good stewardship of resources in ways that benefits communities directly. And then, of course, all of us who are at the other end of value chains, accessing delicious coffee grown in a sustainable way or whatever the products might be. But the way that we work is we have those broad priorities, but we have an open call process. So we invite nonprofit organizations across the region that are working within those priorities to apply. And as a result, we get a really good sense of kind of what's going on in the region, what organizations and leaders and communities are prioritizing. And we are kind of increasingly thinking about our role, not just as responding with our own funding, but helping connect the dots to donors, whether it's individual donors or foundations who would like to kind of have a finger on the pulse of what's going on in the region and get access to some of those opportunities. And I know that's, of course, something that Myriad is able to offer as well to its clients and partners.
Yeah, and to dig in that a little bit in terms of the donors who are interested in giving, what kinds of mechanisms are you seeing being used to move philanthropic giving internationally? And is that evolving? I mean, we know the kind of traditional donor advised fund space, but generally we find in the US that people are talking more and thinking more creatively. And so specifically for Latin America and the Caribbean, are you seeing anything interesting in terms of actual giving mechanisms?
Yeah, I'll speak to that, and I'm sure Monica has thoughts as well. I think this is such a big area of opportunity. Again, going back to that same data that I cited before, it indicates that at least as of 2019, 2020, five US foundations were contributing about half of all of the funding to Latin America, and of those five, 50% of their funding was going to US 501c3s. So, organizations based here in the United States doing work in Latin America. So that means that there's a lot of space and a lot of opportunities for all of us to be moving more funds toward locally led organizations that are doing the most relevant work in the region, that are working with the invitation and support of communities and are really positioned to make a sustainable and enduring impact. And to your question, Sheena, I just think there's more and more ways to be able to do that. So, and it doesn't necessarily require Latin American organizations setting up a 501c3 in the United States. There are intermediary platforms like Myriad, of course, that can help donors connect to organizations and that can help organizations in Latin America fundraise in the United States. We're also seeing really interesting models around co-funding that allow not just foundations, for example, to pool resources, but in the example of one fund that we're involved in, with foundations and individual donors and family foundations kind of coming together to pool resources precisely around this issue of educational recovery in the post-pandemic context. So by working with the right intermediary, we can, on the one hand, make sure that everyone is able to give in the way that they need to, given their organizational structure, but that our funds are reaching frontline organizations in the region that are doing the most important and urgent work on this issue. And I think, one of the one of the great things about working in Latin America is that there is this kind of collaboration and coordination between donors and kind of across borders that I think we can do even more with.
Yeah, thank you. And Monica, I mean, when you're thinking about and thinking about donor engagement strategies and talking to donors, are you seeing anything interesting happening with next gen donors or emerging philanthropy in this space? Are you seeing kind of new donors wanting to do things differently? Or what are the conversations you're hearing and insights you're picking up from maybe more of the newer trends in the donor side?
Yes, yes, sure. I think in the terms of the next generation, many donors they are interested in technology, in the use of the technology in a different way. For example, like how we can use drones, no, for social change. How we can use AI. AI is something a little bit new, but I think more like drones and technology. There have been interesting initiatives in the Amazon when some communities are already using drones to patrol some areas that are very far. So if something happened, the drone can take a picture or a video and can report that to the police or to the community, and they can immediately do an action. No, and I think when I share this kind of initiative, this is something that really donors are looking forward to learn. No, and the most challenging aspect I think is the language. No, and I think this is when Myriad has a very important role because, for example, last year we have a giving circle in coordination with NEET, this network of international donors or donors interested in international causes. And in the giving circle, we have an indigenous leader from the highlands of Peru. She speaks Spanish with Aymara, which is a very particular way of speaking Spanish. So we found an interpreter in the US who was a native English speaker, but also with Aymara and Quechua heritage. So that interpreter was able to really provide an accurate translation because that was not necessarily for us accurate to find a regular interpreter. So that donor or the group of donors have the chance to talk with this leader who was talking from the highlands of Puno. And I think that is something related to how we can really continue to create mechanisms where
Yeah.
indigenous people, indigenous community that they don't speak Spanish or Portuguese can have a direct access to donors. And I think this is something that I call sometimes the democratization of fundraising, no? Because a donor should have the right and the opportunity to talk with someone who lives in a very remote community, but as peers. And that is the same as the opportunity that we would like to offer to indigenous people and Afro-descendant people as well. Just saying, giving circles, learning circles or affinity groups where donors can start having a conversation. They have a commitment, but they don't commit themselves with that amount of money yet, but at least they want to learn how they can understand more about a specific community or project. We also have the pool funds, no, when maybe there is a group of donors that they want to support a cause and they can work together for 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, and they will learn from different initiatives and programs. And at the end of the process, they will decide, the organization that they will receive the money. There are different mechanisms. And just to mention, if a donor would like to have a DAF, a donor advised funds, we can also provide a giving page for the donor. So the donor can talk to their families and their friends and just share more information about why he or she wants to support that cause. So that is kind of a public opportunity to connect this initiative with his or her audience, and network.
Yeah, and I think you're driving at something else, which is sort of the value that, the regional expertise that you bring to these kinds of conversations, why that becomes so important. I mean, there's all these barriers, language, cultural understanding, who are the right people to fund, and those kind of distance donors more and more from the work that they want to fund. And so this is kind of closing that gap a bit. There's a couple questions that have been coming in the Q&A box that, Monica, I think might be useful to address within this question because, people are interested in who should be funded in the indigenous space, for example, or how you kind of weigh regional versus local partnerships, and if there are better ways to fund in the region. So could you speak a little bit to that based on what your experience has been?
Yes, yes, sure. Now I feel like there is a increase of territorial funds. Funds that is more people that they are not being associated by a specific identity or a topic. They are more connected by the region. So people from an area of the Andes, or if you are in El Chaco, which is a biome in Argentina, Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, or if you are from a specific area of the Amazon, because the Amazon have many subregions, no? And I think that is a very interesting opportunity for donors, especially if they want to be sure that the money is not getting diluted in the whole big agenda, for example, of clima. Okay, clima, but where clima? Maybe we want to support communities that they are fighting against fires. Where are the fires located? They are located in very specific areas, for example, between Bolivia and Brazil. And in that area, we will support the Aymaras community, which is an indigenous Andean community, and Amazonic communities. No? And
Sure.
because of that, we will have the possibility to be connected to a very unique and specific culture, which is an indigenous culture. So I feel that now there is more interest in having this kind of approach from donors. And the other, I think, is basically in terms of the use of technology. I remember that after COVID, there was a big gap, especially from kids, no, because they didn't have the access to technology, because where many kids and teenagers, they were receiving classes virtually, but they don't have internet. And now I feel that we are still having donors and people asking about that, how we can fill the gap of technology for learning, no, for kids and for teenagers. For many years, many donors, they want, for example, to provide computers, but after a while we realized that we cannot have computers because there is no electricity in the community, no? So how we can create conditions so they can really use computers, or maybe now they won't use computer, at least they will have a phone, a smartphone. So there is an evolution in the interest, and I think the use in this kind of technology like smartphones are something that many donors are feeling that is a new tool, no, that maybe can reduce the burden of creating a big infrastructure with 10 or 20 or 50 computers in a classroom.
That makes sense. And we've sort of generally been touching on the threat of climate change and the climate crisis and many of these responses. And I think it's telling that it is a region that has a lot of interest and need when it comes to smart climate programs. Caroline, can you sort of give us a sense from your perspective on, this balance between the region being very vulnerable to climate change, but also sort of a leader in many ways in terms of the kinds of initiatives that we've seen come out of the countries there. What are some of those vulnerabilities and opportunities, and anything that stands out in your work or in what you've seen?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll take the example just of a few countries in Central America where, to this contrast that you're making, on the one hand, we have Costa Rica, which has successfully reforested essentially the entire country, which is really a global model for how you not only recover lost nature, but then harness it for a thriving tourism industry. So there are certainly those really encouraging models there of how you combine kind of good public sector policy with civil society mobilization, private sector engagement, philanthropic support, and so forth. On the other hand, we see the dry corridor, for example, of Central America. Think, countries like Guatemala, Honduras, that contribute very little carbon, and yet are one of the absolute hotspots in terms of already getting the impacts of climate change in ways that destabilize agricultural weather patterns, agriculture, et cetera. And so there, part of the response that we're seeing is kind of new approaches to, well, I'd say a combination of ancestral practices, kind of bringing back what has worked before for communities over the long term, but also introducing new approaches like regenerative agriculture that can help make sure that rural communities are more resilient to climate change and to all of the shocks and stresses that come with it. And that is, I think, an area where, again, international philanthropy can be extremely effective. And I would also sort of give another example to that, to Monica's point about, the potential for technological leapfrogging on certain things. We're seeing some really exciting work, for example, in rural Guatemala around bringing solar energy to rural towns where the grid is not, hasn't arrived or isn't reliable, but solar can provide not just energy for private use, but also power community centers, right? Can power schools. So I think there's a really big opportunity to think about how fairly modest philanthropic support can help communities get to where they need to be in this new climate context.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And it's also making me think, Monica, you said earlier you were referring to just the diversity of geography in terms of we have the Andes, we have the Amazons, we've got complex island ecosystems in the Caribbean, which we don't want to forget in this conversation. There's a lot of complexity and, smaller opportunities that can be leveraged for big impact, specifically with sort of the geographic landscape that we have in this region. Where are you seeing opportunities to really address, I think, the complexity of the climate crisis? And what are some of these kind of amazing models that are coming out, especially if you don't mind speaking to the Caribbean as a region, the hundreds of islands that are there? How do communities, and who are very, very vulnerable to, the climate crisis and ongoing disasters? Can you give a little bit of flavor of what we're seeing there and opportunities that are arising for donors to think about?
Yes, sure. And I would like to highlight the Caribbean and maybe the Andes as two very important ecosystems. We have been now working in partnership with organizations of Bahamas, St. Vincent, and we are very glad that Myriad is now expanding its interest operations in the Caribbean. We talk a lot about the blue economy. We understand the blue economy as the economy of the waters, not the sea, the lakes, the rivers. But I think in the case of the Caribbean, the most challenging component that they told me is because they are small islands. Many donors, they think that the problems are small. And many donors, they forget that the impact could be really amazing because they are content. They live in an island. No? If you put something there, will impact everybody. And there are some islands that they have maybe 150,000 people, but that island, usually like St. Lucia, for example, when I was last year, they collaborate very close with St. Vincent. So they really work together as a whole ecosystem, and they had the possibility to create circular economy, among the islands, because this is what they are already doing. So one specific area is the ecotourism, of course, because there are many people that enjoy amazing vacations in the Caribbean, and because of that, they have a very emotional connection with the Caribbean as well, which is an opportunity. The most important aspect right now that they are discussing is the climate change in terms of the resiliency. Because now the life of many people is really changed because they cannot plan 1 year ahead. Before, of course, for centuries, they were living in the islands and they get used to have some hurricanes, but now it's something that they need to wait and they don't know the amount of destruction. This is why, for example, we are now working with a Bahamas Resilience Center because they are working more in the mental health component of the climate, because they say everybody is talking about how we can adapt the land, but what happened with us because we cannot plan 1 year ahead. And many people are now suffering depression, for example, especially elders, but even young people. So to have a holistic approach about related to climate justice, or that will be, I think, very important. And we have many islands that are doing that job, and also many islands they have volcanoes And the
Mm-hmm.
volcans are creating a lot of destructions, no? There were some eruptions in some islands like St. Vincent, and they got a lot of support from different celebrities from the Caribbean because, of course, they wanted to support their land. But and the third component about the Caribbean, they're talking a lot about how we can reduce the waste, because once you have waste, the waste stay in the island. No, so there is a lot of contamination in the islands. They are trying now to create a system where if they are working with fishing, that kind of waste of processing fish can be used as a fertilizer in their own community, but they need a lot of resources for that, no? But I want to highlight also the Andes, because in the Andes, in terms of climate, there is a missing component related to the impact on health of the climate change, specifically in the areas between Puno and Cusco, that are the areas with most UV radiation in the world. Because they are very close to the ozone hole, and because the location of these two regions in related to the Ecuador line. So if you are, for example, a farmer and you speak an indigenous language, you are spending 12 hours outside. And there is no information in Quechua or in Aymara, which is that indigenous language, to let them know that they need to protect themselves against the climate change. So people are discussing how we can really create programs in indigenous language that can prevent skin cancer in farmers, right? Because they really don't have the tools, they don't have the sunscreen protection, but most of important is they don't have the information in their own languages. No, there is just a very specific aspect of the impact of climate change in health that I would like to highlight.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I want to move a little bit to some thoughts on the regulatory landscape. But Caroline, was there anything else you wanted to add just on the climate programs and areas of investment or disaster resiliency?
I guess I think Monica's point is so important that if you, as a donor, care about climate, there's a lot of ways to make a difference on that issue. And especially if your concern is not just kind of addressing climate itself, but also kind of acknowledging or grappling with the way that it's disproportionately impacting vulnerable people, particularly in the global south. There's a lot of really incredible opportunities where really giving of any size can make a difference. And I'll just give one more example also from the Caribbean. So the singer Rihanna's foundation, the Clara Leonel Foundation, has an amazing initiative that thinks about the impact of climate change on women's health, for example. So she's done a lot of work in building or increasing the resilience of local community health centers so that women can get the care they need, even in a moment of crisis or disaster, which is, an enormous point of vulnerability. And I think that's just such a powerful illustration of how two potentially, different interests can really come together by bringing this climate lens to the work. And very happy to talk more about those kinds of examples with others. But yeah, we can turn to the regulatory context, Sheena, if you'd like.
No, I mean, I think climate is it's such an important, you can't talk about this region without really digging into climate. So I know there's a lot of examples both of you have and a lot of insights in this space, but maybe we can come back to some of those specific partnerships and examples that you've seen once we get through a couple also of the attendee questions, which are popping in. So let's move to the regulatory landscape and we'll circle back to climate towards the end. But, like we've talked about, it's a diverse region. There's a lot of differences in the way national governments are regulating civic space. The opportunities to invest have to also be met with sort of the ease of giving to those places. So, Caroline, maybe could you speak a little bit just at a high level? What are the trends you're seeing in terms of regulations? Where is giving complex? And have you seen some, ways to navigate that?
Yeah. So I would say, definitely varies country to country, and it's, important to either do your own due diligence around what that landscape looks like, or work with trusted partners who do this work every day, and can make sure to kind of accompany you in that work. There are certainly in the region pretty closed spaces in terms of civil society where it's not impossible to fund, but it requires a lot of care. And I would say a kind of orientation of first do no harm in terms of the impact of your funding on partners. And those kinds of contexts would include, Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, places where there absolutely are fantastic civil society organizations doing desperately important work, all the more important because of the political challenges of their context, but where, I think you want to proceed with a lot of care. And then we see in other places, and this is not just true of Latin America, this is true in Europe, Asia, Africa, across the board, the kind of the rise of these NGO laws that intentionally seek to kind of constrain civic space, make it harder for nonprofits to do their work, and sometimes even attempt to kind of weaponize philanthropy in order to crowd out or silence certain voices. So, there again, it's not that it's impossible to give in those contexts, but just really important to, work with trusted advisors who can help you navigate accordingly. I would say, the Tinker Foundation, we've been around for more than 60 years. We've built up a lot of kind of capacity muscles to be able to do this directly through our grant making. But I think I would certainly advise donors who are interested in doing more in the region to at least get their start, perhaps working with others who can help share some wisdom or guidance along the way to just make sure that they're able to have the impact that they're intending.
Mhm. Yeah, and Monica, you sort of sit in that seat for us here at Myriad USA. You're our in-house expert. You know the region deeply. You look at every grant and every partner that we work with. Maybe you could give us a little bit of a sense of how you approach navigating risk in the region. How do you give donors the reassurance that they need to invest in what is a complex landscape, and any maybe evolving regulations that you're also seeing as you support that work?
Um, yeah, we are seeing an evolving regulation that is really affecting NGOs. That process started maybe in Guatemala a while ago, Mexico, now Peru. And in general, the idea, I think, is like to reduce the power of social society to maybe sue the government when there is any violation against human rights, no? Which is basically one of the main agenda or one of the main reasons behind the regulations. But we also are seeing a lot of regulation in terms of the tax situation. No? So just the idea that the NGOs are not paying taxes sometimes could be disappointing for many governments, and they want to create mechanisms trying to be sure that they can take a little bit of that money as tax, no? Even if legally the NGOs are tax exempt. So we are always very careful and aware that we are sending the money following the legal regulation of the country. Yes, 100%. But we are also working in partnership with many local funds. No, by now I think we are in Latin America fiscal sponsors of at least 8 funds in different countries, and the local funds has the possibility to deploy the money in remote communities or in contexts that are very challenging. Mm-hmm. So that is, I think, something that is very strategic for Myriad. So we are here to facilitate money. If we feel that we want to support a community, or there is a donor who wants to send money to an area that is very complex, we can always talk to a local fund in that country, and that fund can deploy the money to the place where we feel that maybe it could be challenging. No, so we are now working with environmental funds, yes, but I think we are expanding our work to support funds that are not just connected to climate. And in the Caribbean also, we are expanding our relationship with a network of Caribbean organizations. And I think that will be a good opportunity for donors in case they want really to understand and learn more from small communities in the Caribbean, no? Small islands, basically. No?
And Sheena, if I could just add, Monica, what you say about the local funds in Latin America is so important because I think this really is a distinctive feature of how funding works in the region. And as Monica said, there are many, not just on the environment, also on women, thinking about the rights of women and girls, a range of other issues, independent media and so forth. And I guess I would just want to really reinforce that the purpose of these funds is it's not just adding another layer of administration or intermediation. They are really providing capacity building, networking support, cross-learning between organizations that might be very, in very remote contexts that otherwise don't have an opportunity to engage with peers or kind of build movements together. Often they're thinking about things like safety and security of rights defenders. So really there, at each of these sort of levels, there's, I think, an important value add that goes beyond just moving the money in full compliance with local law, as Monica is saying.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah, and is if it's I just want to give an example. There are, for example, some communities that even if it's completely legal to send the money, if they have the bylaws, so because they don't get used to get international money, just sending the money can create some flags, and they are suffering a lot of harassment from the banks. No, just not because they are doing something wrong. It's just because they don't get used to receive money from abroad. No, and this is why Myriad, in that case, because our main goal is to support the donor, but also to protect the integrity of the organization. No, we can talk to any partner in the country that can help us to understand the context and the complexity. No.
Right. Yeah, and that's going to sort of the importance of local knowledge that centers the work at Myriad USA. Yes, we transact grants, but ultimately we build relationships, and you can't build relationships without really visiting the region, knowing who does this kind of work, what the best mechanism is, the best entry point. I know we have a question from the audience that's asking about how we actually build these relationships. How do we find these funds? Do donors bring that to you, Monica or Caroline, or do you go out and find it? Like, how do you know so much about the region and the right ways to navigate some of these countries? Either of you can take that.
I can go first. I mean,
Yeah.
as I mentioned before, we have this open call process that's wonderful in terms of identifying organizations that are doing great dynamic work. So that's sort of the beginning of the funnel. But I would also say that there is a tremendously vibrant and connected network of funders, both in the US, in the region, all working together to identify great organizations and exchange ideas. And so, a few that come to mind immediately, Focus Central America is a close partner of ours. And they are part of the way they think of their work is to help connect the grassroots organizations they fund with other donors, right? So these are all doors that that donors or philanthropic advisors can knock on along with Myriads to get ideas. I think there's a real openness to that because we all recognize that there is far more amazing work that could happen in the region than there is funding flowing within the region or to the region at the moment. And so everyone is, I think, primed to help make those introductions and connections.
Thank you. Monica, what do you think?
Yes, and we have both sides. No, we work with donors, like we have donor advice funds, we have legacy funds, advice give, and we always trying to understand what the donor wants. Many donors, they already know where they want to send the money. In all the cases, we are conducting the same due diligence, being sure that the organization is capable to receive money. And if there is any inconvenience, we talk to the donor and we explain. And sometimes in few cases, the donor, they don't have necessarily organization, but they know the topic and the country. Mm-hmm. So this is when our second half appears. We are fiscal sponsor of 1,400 NGOs based outside of the US. So we have a very robust directory of organizations. Any donor can go to the directory online and explore and find the best organization. But if there is any fit, this is when the portfolio of organizations that we are building appears. We, as Myriad, we love to sponsor different conferences, different international conferences, not necessarily because we are going to maybe be sending a grant to the network that we are sponsoring. It's more because sponsoring conferences is an opportunity to support the whole ecosystem of philanthropy first, and second, have the chance to know more local actors And in the future, when there is any kind of request from a donor, we already know who is who. In terms of how I choose the organization, no? I think in general, I have a list of organizations per country, and my criteria is let's have at least 35% indigenous led, 35% Afro-descended led, and the less 40% is mixed. No, so that is something important because the idea is like in each country we will have a panorama of the relevant organizations that are doing a good work, but also being aware of this ethnical and cultural diversity that I mentioned before. So when a donor comes to us, if they want to support mental health, oh, but what if you want to support mental health intersected with climate justice, like as I mentioned in Bahamas, no? Or what if you want to support mental health from a community in Sao Paulo that they are having a cafe called Crazy Wisdom because many of them, they really have a lot of issues with mental disability, but now they're working as farmers. So we like to intersect, no? But of course, we are always open to listen to what is the interest of donors and what organizations would like to offer to the society.
And Sheena, if I can just make one last point, which also relates to your question about kind of what's the vanguard of giving, what is Next Gen interested in? For those donors who are also interested in impact investing strategies and thinking of ways or tools beyond just traditional philanthropic giving, Latin Pacto, and I'll drop the link in the chat, is a fantastic region-wide network that's the perfect point of entry for anyone interested in doing this work. And Latin America is really emerging as a hub of this kind of impact capital work, particularly Colombia. So lots of really great opportunities in the climate space, ed tech, and beyond. So that's just another resource. And they also host an annual conference that's very welcoming for newcomers.
Absolutely. And Monica, they're one of our partners too, right? Latin Pacto.
Yes, yes. And we are also co-founders of Latin Pacto, and would love really to support the ecosystem, as I said before. No, we are always open to move, for example, seed grants for the impact investment agenda, and I think like now we feel that many donors in the US, they are understanding, of course, more why they can invest in causes that will have a social impact in a medium or long term. But I feel like there is like this kind of transition, no, from many donors because Africa, I know that there has a long tradition of startups and impact investment. And in the case of Latin America, I feel like because the barrier of the language, you know, many donors of family foundations in the US that they are already supporting impact investment projects in Africa, they really are not supporting Latin America yet because they didn't have that connection, no? And many donors, they don't visit the conferences in Latin America as well because of the language. So now we encourage everybody here to be really, to explore the opportunity to go to Latin Pacto or other conferences in the region. Many of the conferences are offering interpretation in English. So which is something very important to know.
Yeah, absolutely. I know we have just about 7-8 minutes left before we have to wrap up, and I want to make sure we get to some of the remaining questions from the audience. So let me turn to that really quick. We have someone who is asking about attracting donor attention. And essentially, you know, what are some recommendations on growing the capacity of local resource mobilization? And how are you guys seeing maybe that dynamic playing in with international funding and things like that? What are some of the pressures there? Or recommendations, maybe, if an organization is looking to attract donors?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the local resource mobilization, I think this is another space of real opportunity for example, US foundations and donors to work in more coordinated ways with their Latin American counterparts. There are just in many countries of the region, some structural differences that disincentivize giving compared to, for example, the tax regime we have in the United States, which is more favorable for donors. But that's not to say that there isn't substantial local activity, and particularly in certain issue areas, as I mentioned before. So I think one really important thing that we can do from the United States is just approach our Latin American counterparts with curiosity and openness about what they're doing. And we may find sort of more work than what we're expecting. I also think it would be interesting, maybe Monica or Sheena, to hear from you about some of the support that you're providing, for example, to cultural institutions in Latin America to build more robust fundraising capability, because I would imagine that extends not just to accessing international donors, but also domestic ones.
Yeah, Monica, do you maybe have a thought on that, on sort of
Uh,
regional resource
yes,
mobilization?
yes, and I think that during the COVID was a good opportunity for organizations in Latin America, first to work remote, but also to create a system to receive online donations.
Mm.
So, and because of that, now many organizations that are more familiar with the idea of doing international fundraising using giving platforms like Myriad. And I think that is a very good opportunity. And for us, we are very connected to some of the platforms in Latin America that they are collecting these funds, like Donar Online, for example, is one of the very amazing organizations that they are really doing a lot of good work, helping small or big organizations in Latin America to do online donations or to collect online donations. And I think that in the case of the main problem that they face is many donors that they were using the button to donate in Latin America. If they were based in the US, they didn't receive the tax and donation, but they were doing that anyways because they wanted to support the cause, no? And
Yep.
this is the gap that we identify, and this is how Myriad maybe they can support them.
Yeah, that makes sense. And there's kind of a similar question related to the differences between regional and local partners and how to manage local activations with regional partners. So we've kind of touched on it a couple times that there are different entry points depending on the kind of work that should be supported and what the best kind of entry point is in terms of understanding the local context, folks who are already plugged into some of those hyper local spaces and leveraging those partnerships. But any last thought on just kind of that balance between in trying to get local, how you leverage kind of regional groups in that strategy? Monica, any thoughts from you? And you may have already addressed it,
Okay.
but
Yeah, I think like maybe for a donor first is what would you like to support? You would like to support a community or like a group, for example, women's rights, children's rights, or more an indigenous or Afro-descendant group. So your interest is more related to culture, to tradition, or to like a topic like mental health, no, or climate. So once you decide that, or maybe your topic could be more based in a regional interest. You want to support the Andes, or you want to support Argentina. So once you decide that is when you can start taking decisions about how you are going to connect to the community. If you really would like to support something concrete related to, for example, promote the generation of income, of course, you can start exploring co-ops. There are amazing groups that they are now producing cacao and coffee. No, so I think it's basically a start for this is the starting point about what you want to support, and after that, media can help, of course.
yeah, thank you. Caroline, any thoughts on that? Pretty much. Okay. We've got a couple minutes. Let me look. There's one more directed at Caroline. Just you threw out a fact that about 6% of international giving is going to the region. And do you know who's doing that giving? Specifically, if there's like diaspora groups, Latino groups, just trying like beyond remittances, kind of what's making up that giving trend?
Yeah. The data that I have isn't disaggregated in terms of the profile of where it's coming from. I appreciate the question, and I do just want to say that I think in any of these conversations, it's important to just acknowledge that remittances vastly, outweigh any amount of philanthropic funding we're talking about. So they do play an incredibly important role, not just in, family well-being, but in community development as well. And there's some really interesting thinking around how to harness that even more. But that said, I'd say one real, I think, area of opportunity is that we haven't talked about yet is the growth of community foundations in Latin America. So we see this in places like Mexico, Colombia, Brazil, Chile. So really as hubs of giving at a kind of community or territorial level beyond just an individual donor. And I think what's so exciting about that is that someone in the diaspora, right, in the United States has a way of giving to the most important and compelling projects in the specific state or city that they are from. And I think we're even starting to see some really interesting kind of community to community contacts, right? Community foundation to community foundation contacts. So I think, again, it comes back to this idea of certainly as a donor, if you're interested in identifying the single organization or set of organizations you want to support, you can take that path. But there's so much to, I think, be learned and accomplished by working in coordination with others in various ways. And again, community philanthropy is one way of doing that in the region.
Thank you. All right, I think I might wrap us up because we're 2 minutes out. Monica, you unmuted. Did you have something
Yeah.
to close with? Yeah.
Just previous to, connected to the previous question, just to a donor, maybe ask the question, what what is the change that they would like to see? What is the war that I would like to see? And I think this is kind of a very basic question. Starting with that question, a donor can start, okay, let me find this country, maybe just identify this specific topic, but it's very important to understand what is the inspiration, no?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think anybody who's interested in learning about how to strategically invest in it, learn more about our due diligence work at Myriad USA, the role of an intermediary, the role that a foundation like Tinker can play in just thinking through with donors how you want to invest, please reach out to us and follow up, and we'll be happy to take your interest further. And with 1 minute left, I'm going to quickly close us up. Caroline, Monica, thank you so much for joining us today. It was a pleasure. And all of you for attending and listening to the recording. We really appreciate you joining us. If you have any questions for any of us, email info@myriadusa.org. Check out our website, and you'll find all of our individual staff emails. Thank you so much again, and we look forward to seeing you at future events. Have a lovely day.
Thanks, Sheena.
Thank you. Bye.